by the time you get up to 6,000,
Yeah, so one of the problems with bearings, is that you still have to seal the crankcase. So there's a cage roller that goes in here.
okay,
My
yep,
example's falling apart, but
yep,
anyway. So, but look what we have up here. We have a bronze,
Bush.
still have a bronze bushing.
okay, so you
And-
got drag, yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's not a lot of drag if it's machined correctly. One of the things that held back going to all ball or roller bearings on mains is sealing. So in 28, they really didn't have good seals figured out. And I think Kale probably was the breakthrough company with that, because I've seen some Kale crankcases, double ball bearings up top, single on the bottom, with nice seals of some kind. I don't know if they were leather or
Well, leather was kind of the standard of the
standard
industry for
day.
a,
So, but Kale actually really pushed the seals in the roller bearings, ball bearings, and so they were kind of progressive around that. Here we are now, 28, moving into 29. Evinrude solid with the roller bearing idea. Of course, Johnson in 29 now comes out with a whole different run of engines, and that's their S45 model Seahorse 16 and the V45 model Seahorse
so that's all,
2
that's roller bearing on the connecting rod, but
Yes.
bronze
mains.
mains
Right,
on it,
right.
okay, all
So,
right.
so Johnson finally recognized that if you really have to have that roller bearing technology on the rods, you have to, you just have to be able to get the speeds and the horsepowers out of these things that,
Okay,
yeah.
yeah. Well, I mean, they are a very different engine. The S and the V45
Yeah.
put out considerably more
Of course,
horsepower.
right. And that's
Particularly-
partially, you know, people credit it to the rotary valve, okay? A really good induction system. But what people also don't maybe recognize so much is that the exhaust is superior on these for two-stroke. And the reason why it's superior is because the exhaust ports are now facing behind, okay?
Let's take a look at that,
Yeah.
okay?
So the exhaust ports now are facing rear, and there's no longer any real restriction, like a three-port engine, which we'll go look at.
You got that Lockwood Chief right here.
Yeah, well, let's look at this big,
Okay.
Johnson
Yeah,
Bridge one.
you have to
You see
swing
what happens
underneath.
here? The exhaust comes out the bottom, it hits a brick wall. So
How come they couldn't take it out of the back on these?
it was, you know, really difficult to have all the ports in the cylinders. I mean, there's an intake port, there's
Okay.
a bypass port, there's an exhaust port.
Okay,
Kinda
and
hard to do all that.
So this is a standard of the industry right here.
Yeah, right.
Because the Lockwood Chief has it,
Yeah,
the
the
Kale has
yeah,
it,
yeah, right.
and the Johnson has
Right.
it. Okay,
So it makes for a very restricted exhaust, and it's hard to, you know, Johnson is also, from a design point of view, are saying, we want a 360-degree engine, so how
Okay.
do we get this exhaust over the transom clamp?
okay, so that's, yeah,
So
yeah,
we're gonna keep that really not too tall.
okay.
Well, that really kills horsepower on a two-stroke.
However,
Yeah.
there was a solution to that, was to take the mufflers off altogether.
That's what they did, right?
However, unlike a lot of people think, in the 20s, there were a lot of lawsuits on the lakes,
Yeah, I know,
people restricting the noise level.
right.
And, you know, we think that's something modern, but it's not at all. It happened in the 20s very, very strongly.
Let's get back to bearings.
Okay, yep, good.
But this is good. Okay, so now we're at 29. Lockwood is still struggling with their plain bearing crankshaft.
So they felt that this was their answer
Their
to
answer.
roller bearings,
Right, right.
which
Yeah.
didn't really cut the
And-
mustard.
Elto was in the same rut,
Okay,
okay? The Elto rut was, here we have a 29 Speedster, bronze rods, high-speed Speedster, aluminum rods, plain bearing, okay?
Right.
4,000 plus
that would be
RPM.
this over here, we went from, well, I don't know which is which.
This is the service Speedster,
Okay,
7
this
horse.
7 horsepower competing against Lockwood Chief in 1928
Right,
at
which was
11 or
11, right,
12,
yeah, right.
Evinrude at 12,
Right.
And this is the high-speed speeder of
29 comes
29.
along and they say, well, we're way behind with this little 7-horse.
So there's
Class
some
B
real
motor.
technology here. Besides
Yeah.
just the induction,
Right.
the bearing system is a lot.
Still plain
Stiff.
bearing, aluminum rods, but the induction system was
Was the key to 11 horsepower versus 7?
Yeah, and
Okay.
and that's at the 3-port breathing in the back. behind
Okay.
the cylinders. There's actually a 3-port kind of engine there,
Okay.
but just air, not fuel and oil mix. So it's you're still depending on the carburetor for its fuel and oil.
I think, Bill, to some degree, modern oils make an inadequate bearing system work quite a bit better
Maybe.
to
I don't know.
give these things a longevity. I believe that personally. I think that has a lot to do with why this thing, I've never had to take it apart, and it puts out on a race boat
Yeah,
very,
it's- right.
very, very well.
It does well, I know.
Right.
So that was probably the rush to be able to get a Class B engine out.
Okay.
Elto that would be at least a little closer to the rest of the Class B engines of 29. 29 Elto quad, 25, 26 horsepower, high-speed quad, plain bearing.
Okay.
Yeah. And.
How'd that compare with the V45?
Yeah, there's really, the 29 Elto quad was end of technology, the V45 was beginning of technology.
Okay. All right.
And that's kind of what happened. I think probably the great merger, the Lockwood Evernewt Elto merger that happened in, kind of late 29, changed the Elto company's kind of conservative views about plain bearings. And it became very clear with the success Johnson had with their roller bearing, big engines, and Evernewt as well, that something had to happen by 1930.
It was kind of the end of the era of the battery ignition, too.
Yeah, that was starting to lose, I think, popularity. Johnson has this great magneto that they, started.
There we go. Yep, go ahead.
Okay.
Yep.
So, a little bit more on bearings now. Okay, so now we're, well accepted, now bearing technology is this cage steel roller bearing, and that persisted well for Evernewt products, with the Speedy Twin and Speedy Fork persisted identical to this bearing, even in 1950. But other things were happening in the outboard industry as well. And back to Johnson and needle bearings. The next anti-friction breakthrough was with uncaged bearings, that we call needle bearings. And
that's the connecting rod that goes with it. It's again a forged steel.
case
Yep.
hardened.
But loose needle bearings
Loose-
versus caged needle bearings
Right.
right here,
Right.
we see loose needle bearings.
So I think I'm willing to, at this point, say that maybe Johnson was the pioneer with this. I always thought Mercury was, but this is a bearings and connecting rod from a Johnson KR like 55 or something
Okay.
like that. That would
All right.
be
So somewhere along
around
the line,
1932.
this engine right here,
Right.
which is the service model of that racing engine,
Right.
they changed the phosphor bronze
the
with.
service had bronze,
Yeah.
and the racing KR version had these needle bearings.
Loose needle
Yeah.
bearings. All right.
And so I think maybe Johnson was a pioneer there, but I could be wrong. But I don't know of any other outboard makers at the time that had loose needles. I think most of them stayed with the caged rollers.
What's the friction differential between the two?
The real difference, if you study the like a Timken bearing catalog, is they talk about RPM ranges. And in the catalogs, and the catalogs, the technical sections claim that the cage roller bearings can withstand much higher RPMs than the loose needles.
Really?
Yeah.
But I think the thinking was opposite of that.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So that's a modern concept, and I've seen Mercury Marine change from loose needle bearings
Back
to
to-
cage, back
yeah,
to caged.
yeah.
Well, they never had caged roller bearings that I know of.
Right,
Other than the ball bearings
Yeah.
and the end of the crankshaft. So,
yeah,
yeah, so that's very interesting.
right.
Yeah, and personally, the cage bearings have a far greater tolerance for pits, corrosion,
Right.
very rough surfaces,
Yeah.
and everything. I
Yeah.
mean, they're a lot more tolerant.
Very forgiving of
Yes,
imperfections.
these are not.
Right.
You get
Yeah.
one of these at the top of the rod here, where the pressure is.
Right.
And you get a little bit of sitting there with a little bit of water underneath it. It'll make a groove
Right.
that bearing will
It'll
drop
hitch.
into,
Right,
and then not turn.
and it'll start pounding.
And it'll literally turn all those needle bearings into one solid bearings.
Right.
I've seen it
Yeah.
happen
I've seen
many times. with Mercury's.
Welded together.
Yes,
Yeah, I've
yes.
seen that myself.
Right.
Yeah.
Very common
Right.
it was in the 70s, 60s, and 70s.
But this, and again, it's probably a cost issue, because obviously to make this machine cage, it
Yes.
costs money.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
It costs money to do that. So they,
But
there's
this is a
probably
racing issue right here.
Yeah,
though.
but it really evolved into almost everything. had these.
Cost is very,
Almost-
very important,
Yeah.
but I can see, but I also am totally convinced that loose needle bearings are considered to be faster than caged.
Yeah.
I mean, as a mechanic, that's the way,
Right.
that's the way my thinking
Yeah.
goes. I may be totally wrong, and obviously I am, but
Right.
that was my perception that Mercury pushed
I
with
think
us.
what it is that these needles are rubbing against each other,
Yes,
and that makes it kind of hard on them. Whereas the caged, even though the cage is the roller's rubbing against the side of the cage, it's not at not at an opposite speed as
true.
the needles
Those
next
are,
to each
yeah,
other.
you're right. You've got one rolling against the other one. The one's coming up and one's going down.
Yeah, right.
In this particular case, it's staying static and it's just rubbing
Right.
against.
Yeah.
Good thinking.
So I think
Great.
that's why.
Yeah,
But
makes
this,
sense.
This really became the industry standard, and with great success. I mean, really, when you think about how many outboards were made with needles.
True,
You know,
but
by-
the Johnson Evinrudes, like that, the 50s engines over there, the 10 and the 7, the 18 there, those have caged roller bearings in them.
Do they?
Yes, they do. They're not needle bearings.
On the rods?
On the rods, on the crankshaft end
Mains.
of the rod,
Yeah.
this end right here, they're caged.
Are they?
Yes, they are.
I don't know much about the modern
Yeah,
engines.
they are. Now, when I don't see needle bearings in Johnson Evinrudes until we get into the 70s and 80s. Those
Okay.
little dinky 4 horsepower twin cylinder engine that replaced the 3 horsepower over there.
Oh.
Those they had shoes, hard metal shoes in an aluminum connecting rod with loose needle
Oh,
bearings.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Yeah. But when you really think about the post-World War II outboard industry, I mean, needles were really in everything. And that really, the breakthrough that needles allowed was needing less oil in the gasoline.
That's the whole.
And that became as time goes on to the present, that becomes a big issue about mixing oils. And I think the outboard manufacturers, probably late 50s, were under pressure to reduce the amount of oil in the gasoline. And
Yeah.